Coastal communities in New Jersey face an increasing amount of flood risk due to sea level rise. Using an approach developed by a team at Rutgers University, this story map illustrates how coastal flood exposure may increase in the future. Rutgers University scientists estimate that the sea level in New Jersey could rise between 1.1 feet and 2.3 feet by 2050 and 2.5 feet and 5.9 feet by 2100. These ranges, along with estimates developed by others, reflect what's unknown about how various factors affecting climate change may impact sea level rise. However, these estimates all indicate a significant rise in sea level during the 21st century. Following Hurricane Sandy, attention in New Jersey turned to better understanding how vulnerable coastal areas are to sea level rise and varying levels of tidal flooding. In consultation with coastal hazard experts and government agencies, Rutgers University researchers developed an approach to identify areas most vulnerable to coastal flooding, storm surges, and sea level rise. For this approach, Rutgers combined several existing flood risk maps, including storm surge, flood insurance rate maps, and current chronic tidal flooding. Sea level rise estimates also were incorporated. The assessment considers the frequency and potential magnitude of current and future flood risks. Areas that are severely flood-prone or exposed to high storm waves are ranked as extreme, while areas with a lower flood risk are ranked as moderate. Present-day areas ranked as having a high exposure roughly mirror the areas currently classified by FEMA as A zones that do not currently experience chronic tidal flooding. These future scenarios may provide a glimpse as to how coastal flood zones in New Jersey may expand due to sea level rise. Much of New Jersey's heavily developed shore, including the Atlantic Barrier Islands and the Delaware and Raritan Bayshore communities, have varying levels of flood exposure. Extreme exposure is limited to tidal marshes, low-lying areas that have chronic tidal flooding, and shorelines most at risk from high waves during storms. The model shows that more than 148,000 acres statewide currently have a high coastal flood exposure. Due to sea level rise, these high exposure areas are expected to increase by 12% by 2050 and 25% by 2100. Zooming in to specific cities provides a more detailed glimpse. The vast majority of Atlantic cities, nearly 40,000 residents, live in a FEMA-designated flood zone. The Rutgers assessment found that about 5,600 residential parcels with a value of nearly $1.2 billion currently have a high exposure. About 1,300 commercial parcels, including Atlantic City's 11 casino buildings, have a high coastal flood exposure. According to tax records, these parcels have a 2013 value of more than $6.7 billion. Nearly all of Atlantic City schools and the city's 14 miles of designated evacuation routes have a high exposure. The model shows that in 2050, the number of residential parcels in a high exposure area may decline by nearly 400. Those parcels may instead have an extreme exposure, which indicates areas with chronic tidal flooding or exposure to high storm waves. The number of commercial parcels with a high exposure stays about the same. By 2100, the number of residential parcels with high exposure may decline by nearly 40%, but the residential parcels with an extreme exposure may increase sixfold to more than 2,400. The number of commercial parcels with a high exposure decreases by about 200, but the number with an extreme exposure increases by about the same amount. In Newark, New Jersey's most populous city with more than 277,000 residents, coastal flooding is a risk for much of the eastern side of the city, especially the Ironbound neighborhood. This neighborhood is known for its high social vulnerability and substantial immigrant population that has limited English proficiency. Citywide, more than 700 residential parcels currently have a high coastal flood exposure. These parcels are valued at more than $150 million. More than 450 commercial parcels, valued at more than $450 million, have a high exposure, as do nearly 200 known contaminated sites. The model shows that in 2050, the number of residential parcels with a high exposure more than doubles to more than 1,500. The number of commercial parcels with a high exposure increases by more than one-third. By 2100, the model shows that the number of residential parcels with a high exposure doubles again to nearly 3,000. The number of commercial parcels with a high exposure increases by one-third to more than 1,100. As New Jersey's coastal communities continue to recover from Hurricane Sandy, many are conducting additional planning and policy revisions to address flooding concerns. Thousands of homeowners along the New Jersey shore are elevating their houses to meet new base flood elevation requirements. Some towns also are working with recovery managers and Rutgers University to better understand their specific vulnerabilities so they address and reduce their exposure. NJADAPT and these story maps were developed through partnerships within Rutgers University. Funding support for this effort has been provided by the New Jersey Recovery Fund and the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. Data support has been provided by the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection and the Federal Emergency Management Agency.